Well, everyone, the M2 MacBook Airs just came out and I just got my hands on it, so let's go and see how it, compares up to the M1 MacBook Air. Now, I will definitely tell you, I think the M1 MacBook Air was one and is still one of the best deals you can purchase for any MacBook. I bought this thing when it first came out, I returned it, and I've been using the M1 MacBook Pro for a while, just upgraded to the 14-inch one, and I will definitely tell you this M1 MacBook Air still holds up so well at that $999 price tag. In fact, because it's kind of approaching 2 years old now, you can buy these things in the used market for much less than that, probably around $700, and I actually see these things on the used market quite a bit, so even on Amazon they're on sale quite a bit too. On the M2 MacBook Air, this thing is $1199, so that is pretty much the main takeaway. There's a $200 difference between these two. I do think with that additional $200 you're spending brand new on the M2 MacBook Air, I think it's actually a much better MacBook in almost every single way. You're getting a kind of different design, you're getting a newer updated body for the most part, you're getting that MagSafe charger, and I'll definitely tell you it's a good upgrade. It's a really, really good upgrade coming from the M1 MacBook Air, but if you have no complaints about the M1 MacBook Air, I don't even think you need to go up to the M2 one. You know, I've seen a lot of tests, I've seen a lot of performance things people talking about, and it doesn't really seem like the M2 MacBook Air, if you're not already a power user and if you're already not maxing out the capability of an M1 MacBook Air, you're probably not going to need an M2 model anyway. So that's kind of a, broad takeaway, at least at a high level. Now, body-wise, there is actually a little bit of a difference with the body. Historically, with the MacBook Airs, there really wasn't a big design change since 2018, but even before that, they kind of had this narrow design where it started off thicker and then it kind of narrowed down a little bit. With the M2 MacBook Air, this is now a little bit of a different story. It's now completely flat, which personally, I think it looks good, but it kind of took away what I liked about the MacBook Air. I still own MacBook Airs, and I like that tapered off design. I think the M2 MacBook Air is really, really thin, and it looks super good as well, but I guess the M1 MacBook Air is, a little bit more thinner in some ways, so that may be one thing you want to take a look at. In terms of the port selection, they have essentially the same amount of ports, but the M1 MacBook Air does not have that MagSafe charger. The M2 model does in fact have that MagSafe charger. So for a lot of people, this is probably something you want to take a look at. And personally, when I actually went ahead and used, my M2 MacBook Air, I like having that, MagSafe charger. My 14-inch model, I like having that MagSafe charger. Personally, I never use it. I almost always use a Thunderbolt, connector because I always have a Thunderbolt display, but it's always cool to have another port there. I think that's one of the bigger features of the M2 MacBook Air. And that's kind of it on the outside. There's really not that big of a difference. Now, flipping these things open, that is where the bigger differences lie. With the M1 MacBook Air, you had a 13.3-inch display on this model. And like I've said before with many different MacBooks, I think these MacBooks look great. I'm not a humongous fan of the, amount of bezel around the display, but I don't really think it's that big of a deal. And personally, I think there's been way worse displays Apple has made, especially with the 2015 MacBook Air. And this one with its Retina display still looks great. And I think it's probably one of its biggest assets. But with the M2 MacBook Air, Apple went ahead and improved that capability even more. This model now has a 13.6-inch liquid Retina display. So when you look at this type of MacBook, that is kind of a pretty big difference in my opinion. Having that type of capability of going from an M1 MacBook Air to an M2 MacBook Air with a bigger display and with that notch, it's almost in the same exact form factor. I think it's in the exact same form factor, but having a little bit of a bigger display is really cool. And personally, the notch isn't really that big of a deal. I haven't really been, complicated by it or, been annoyed by it on my, 14-inch one. So I don't think this one, if you're going to use it for years and years now, I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. But we already know what Apple's going to be doing with the future with this design. They're probably going to remove this notch probably in 4 or 5 years from now. So, if that's a big deal to you, then I would recommend waiting off and getting the M1 MacBook Air. If not, get the M2 model because really, realistically, the only thing they can do is two things: add a ProMotion display and remove the notch on this model. And that's probably what they're going to do in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So that covers it up there. Neither of these models have touch bars. They both have essentially the same type of keyboard and the same type of trackpad as well. So if you're somebody who wanted to go ahead and utilize, a touch bar, you may want to go for the M2 MacBook Pro, but you still have this M2 MacBook Air without the touch bar, which personally I think is a better asset. I don't really like having that touch bar. I never really liked it. And now with, the M2 MacBook Air, you don't have to deal with it either. Now, these two things come in a few different capacities in terms of the model and the RAM and all that. So you can get up to 2 terabytes of storage within both of them, which is good. So you can max out the storage, and they're exactly the same thing. You can get up to 24 gigabytes of RAM though on the M2 MacBook Air, whereas on the M1 MacBook Air, you can only go up to 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now, I will definitely tell you, in my personal use case, I'm editing a bunch of videos, I'm editing a bunch of stuff all the time, and personally, 16 gigabytes of RAM is more than enough, and that is about the cutoff. I really haven't found myself needing to use way more. I think I had 24 gigabytes of RAM on my 5K iMac that I used for a while, and that was overkill as well. So personally, if you're anything like me, where you just kind of do some work on your MacBook, maybe you play some games here and there, 16 gigabytes of RAM is more than enough, but always having more is better. And if you have the money, max out the RAM, that is definitely one of the better areas to go to. But the biggest difference is with that M2 chipset. So you have 8-core CPUs between the M1 and the M2 chipset, but with the M1 model, you can get up to 7 cores of the GPU, but on the M2 model, you can get 10 cores of the GPU. Now, what does this mean? I'm definitely going to tell you, if you're not maxing out the performance like myself, you're not going to notice those big of differences. But if you're if you're a person who's doing a bunch of just like 8K capability, like video editing, if you're like maxing out your MacBook Air where it's constantly hot and it's constantly just like throttling and it just doesn't seem to be holding up to what you want it to do, then I guess the M2 MacBook Air is a better choice. But then at that point, I would go for the M1 Pro or M1 Max models, because those are the type of MacBooks you want. If you're kind of like a casual user, myself, I would consider myself a casual user, even though I'm editing a bunch of videos and I'm doing a bunch of stuff like that and even playing some games every once in a while. My M1 MacBook Pro, could have easily handled everything I threw at it, and I feel like the M1 MacBook Air is no different. With the M2 MacBook Air, it's that, but extra. So if you want to kind of future-proof yourself a little bit longer, I think the M2 MacBook Air is the better one to go, especially from a performance side, because now that we have this next model, Apple's probably going to be focusing on this model for the next few years, and we're going to have the M2 Max and M2 Pro probably in the next 2 years as well. So that's probably what makes the most amount of sense to me, is just to buy that specific MacBook. So I will tell you though, there are still some things that I'm not a fan of between both. You still can only connect one display on the M1 or the M2 MacBook, which I'm not a fan of at all. I want to be able to have as many monitors as I want to, and with the Pro models, you have that capability, just not with the M2 Pro, but with the M1 Pro and M1 Max, you have that capability. But with this one, neither one of these have that capability, so they both kind of take an L there. The front camera on the M2 MacBook Air is a bit better. It's a 1080p sensor versus the 720p sensor on the M1 MacBook Air. And to be honest, it's actually kind of a big difference. Like whenever I use my newer MacBooks, they are actually better MacBooks with a better, webcam, which is really nice to see. There's also somewhat of a better speaker system on the M2 MacBook Air, which is really cool to see. And honestly, those are pretty much the main differences. When I look at the battery life, and also Apple kind of claims that their battery lives are about the same thing on both as well, which is very interesting. So you shouldn't expect to see a massive difference in the battery life, but as always, there can be some differences. If you're getting a used MacBook Air with, battery health degrading, then that's a little bit of a different story. But this takes us to the end of the video. And to be honest, I think the M1 MacBook Air is a better deal than the M2 MacBook Air. So if you currently have an M1 MacBook Air, or if you can get one for a really good price, I would probably just recommend buying it, to be honest. I think that's kind of like a no-brainer. But if you have all the money in the world, and or you don't have an M1 MacBook Air, I would recommend going to the M2 MacBook Air, just not even looking at that specific model. And that really comes down to one thing. The future of the M2 model is way brighter than the future of the M1 model. Meaning, if you want to go ahead and get a MacBook that's going to last the longest amount of time, the M2 model is going to be here for quite a bit of time. I mean, I don't think they're going to be making an M3 chipset anytime soon for at least another 2 years. If they follow the same model as the M1 MacBook Air, we shouldn't expect to see another chipset for at least another 2 years, maybe a year and a half or whatever. But since then, Apple's going to have to go ahead and upgrade all the iPads, or most of the iPads, to the M2 model. They'll have to go ahead and drop the M2 Max and M2 Pro. And I think we have another M2 iPad, and I think we have another iMac dropping too. So there are a lot of devices that Apple's going to be dropping first, I think, before they're going to drop an update to the M2 chipset. So that's kind of how I'd kind of sum it up for the most part. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.